Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharon Walmsley, and I am from the University of Toronto. I will be co-chairing this session today with Dr. Marina Klein from McGill University. We are the co-directors of the Canadian HIV Trials Network, and we're very pleased to be able to present today some of the studies of our CTN young investigators. One of the strengths of the CTN is really in terms of our training and mentoring program. And over the years, we've been able to sponsor many young investigators, trying to get their foot in the door to try and understand HIV research, to have an opportunity to concentrate on a project, to work with one of the investigators of the CTN, and really to have some time to dedicate to HIV research. And one of the great joys of this is that many of our young investigators have continued on and have become investigators and leaders in the Canadian HIV Trials Network. So this is an opportunity for us to really showcase some of the work that they are doing. Now, each year it varies in terms of the number of fellows that we're able to support, usually somewhere between 5 and 10 a year, half of which are in their first year, half of which are in their second year of their training program. So today we have 5 of our young investigators that will be presenting their work. 4 of them are in their first year of their postdoctorate fellow, and 1 is in their second year. So we welcome you to sit back, to listen to their presentations, but this is really an opportunity for you to give them some feedback too, to help them understand, how does their research fit into the context of HIV? How do you think they may change or improve upon their programs? For those of you in the community, is their work going to be important to you? So we really do hope that you will be able to interact with us and to participate. If you want to ask a question, you need to do that through the platform on the current questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to be live, but Marina and I will try and moderate these appropriately so that we can get a little bit of dialogue going on. We laughed that usually this particular meeting is a breakfast meeting, and we all wondered where the bagels were this morning. And unfortunately, it's an evening meeting and we don't even get that glass of champagne. But nonetheless, we will try to be together again virtually, even if we're not in London, Ontario. And if we were in London, Ontario, we'd be going to the Seeps. And when I was in university, I went to university in London, and you could go to the Seeps and get a beer for 25 cents. I'm not sure you can get it for that anymore, but they all came in their trays. So we'll pretend we're there, and we'll pretend they're there. But clearly, we're going to start with the science. And I look forward to hearing all of the presentations of our young CTN investigators. So the first presenter this evening is Serge Vicente. Serge is a statistician. And again, we do welcome postdoctoral fellows from a number of different disciplines. So he is a statistician. He did his undergraduate and master's work in Lisbon, and then came to the University of Montreal, where he did PhD in statistics, and is now joined with Dr. Bertrand Labouche, and has been working on this project that he's going to talk to us today about the diversity index for samples in HIV trials, creating a tool to improve HIV trials generalizability. So welcome, Serge, to the platform.
Sharon, I'm impressed. You know so much about myself. That's impressive. Okay, so just sharing my screen. Diaporama mode. Share. Okay, so I think everything is okay. Perfect. So hello, everyone. My name is Serge Vicente. And as you know, I have a PhD in statistics. I am currently a first-year postdoctoral fellow with CTN, and I'm also affiliated to the Research Institute of McGill University Health Center. And I'm presenting you today the project I'm developing for my postdoctoral fellowship, which names the Diversity Index for Samples in HIV Trials, or simply the DISH, creating a tool to improve HIV trial generalizability. So where comes this idea from? We all know that the randomized controlled trials are the gold standard to establish efficacy and safety for new clinical interventions. But observed outcomes of clinical interventions may differ between individuals because we know that several population subgroups are mostly excluded or underrepresented in the research. So we have here a problem of lack of diversity. And we know that the lack of diversity can reduce generalizability and external validity of the results. And that's also a current issue in HIV research. For example, we know that about 50% of worldwide people living with HIV are women, but only 20% do participate in antiretroviral therapy studies. And so it is well recognized that increasing diversity is recommended to improve external validity. And the good news is that diversity can be measured and quantified statistically. So diversity measures do exist in HIV trials, but they are recent. And the worst is that they are limited to microbiome and viral diversity and also to genetic markers. And they use classical diversity indexes mostly based on counts. So that's not very useful. So I had an idea to propose a solution for that. And my idea is to create a diversity index for samples in HIV trials, so the famous DISH, using this time sample demographics and social determinants of health. And the use of sample demographics and social determinants of health for measuring diversity in HIV is unexplored, and it's a good opportunity to explore. So for my project, I established the following hypothesis. What I want to know is that the hypothesis is that the DISH will allow each research product, for example, a clinical trial, a cohort, a systematic review, and so on, to be rated according to the sample diversity on a 0 to 100% scale. I will develop this DISH in three steps. The first one, mining the literature. Second one, doing some data simulation because I'm a statistician. And third one, a real world application with a real data set. Let's go to the first step. So the mining the literature. What I will do is a scoping review, and currently I'm working on this step. Is that where I am now? And the intent is to identify demographic and social determinants of health variables most frequently used in HIV trials during the last 5 years. When I have a set of variables, I will invite stakeholders to rate the relevance of those selected variables. So for example, I will invite people living with HIV, invited, for example, from CTN, from the I-SCORE patient expert group. I will also invite HIV researchers, healthcare professionals, activists, so also from the CTN, from community organizations. And I am taking the opportunity that all of you are here. So if everyone in this audience is interested to participate in that phase of my study, you can contact me. I will provide my email at the end. So if you are interested, just say, oh, I'm interested in your project. Can you enroll me? Okay, and at the end of this step, what I want to do is to produce recommendations for essential and optional core sets of variables to include to create the DISH. Second step, the statistics. So here I will use the multivariate multinomial distribution to generate several simulated data sets with the variables I kept from step number 1. And with each data set, I will summarize each of it with a similarity matrix. But in statistics, we have a problem. We have a lot of methods to compute similarity matrices. So what I want to do is imagine, for example, that I have generated n data sets, those n here. First, I will try method number 1 for computing the similarity matrix, and I will compute the famous DISH score on a 0 to 100% scale. After that, I use the method number 2 for computing the similarity matrix, and also the same, I compute these scores, and so on. I can apply all the methods that I want. Just a small observation, the DISH scores will be calculated using a formula based on the determinantal point process, which is a statistical way of quantifying diversity in data sets. And as you can see, for each method, I will have a collection of these scores. So a collection for method 1, a collection for method 2, and so on. So I can do whatever I want in statistics, descriptive statistics. I can test hypotheses, I can test normality, I can do histograms, and so on. So I have a lot of opportunities here, and my goal is to choose the best method based on statistical measures. And what is amazing in simulation is that I can play with dimensions, and for example, I can repeat this process for data sets with a small sample size, data sets with a medium sample size, and data sets with a large sample size, to see if the dish is very sensitive or the properties of the dish are sensitive to the sample size. So that's very interesting to do in statistics. What I want to do at the end of this step is to produce an optimal statistical formula to compute the dish using the best method of obtaining a similarity matrix from the data. And finally, for the last step, I will apply the dish formula derived in step 2 to a real data set in HIV research, or I will apply it for a CTN cohort, the Canadian Positive Brain Health Now cohort from Marie-Josée Brouillette and Nancy Mayo. What I want to do in this step is to estimate if the dish is stable or estimate his variability values across resampling of the data and also over time. What will I do with this project, the contribution? So I will first enrich methodologies addressing diversity with computing a global score of diversity. I will improve quantification of generalizability for longitudinal studies. I will promote equity and inclusivity in HIV trials through discussions with stakeholders. And finally, I will encourage knowledge translation with the creation of a user guide to compute the dish for producers and consumers of HIV research. And finally, a lot of thanks to do. So just to know, I am supported by a CTN Postdoctoral Fellowship Award. This project was submitted to FRQS in March 2022. In their call for participations, and I was granted with funding of $30,000, finishing the first one in all the projects presented. Finally, special thank yous I want to address to the CTN for their support, to my supervisor, Dr. Bertrand de Boucher. Oh, I forgot to mention at the beginning, Bertrand de Boucher is my supervisor, sorry. So a special thank you to Bertrand de Boucher, my supervisor, my co-supervisors, Tibor Schuster and Dr. Tibor Schuster and Dr. Joseph Cox. A special thank you to Nancy Mayo for her incredible help for the FRSQ submission, and she's working with me currently in step number 1, and also for all the team members working with me on this project. Thank you for your attention, and you have my contact here.
Okay, so thanks very much for a clear presentation. Often we get lost with statistical presentations, and congratulations on your FRSQ award. Those are not easy to get, and we look forward to seeing some of the results. Now, my interest has always been, we don't have enough women in clinical trials. And so, Serge, I think part of this project I envision is that you will, if this study has 20% women, what would it look like if these 20% were 50%? Is that sort of the way in which you envision this working?
For example, what is interesting, having a global, my video, I'm not here anymore. Okay, I'm disabled. So what is interesting in having a global score, okay, I'm here. Okay, what is interesting in having a global score is that it is applicable to every research. And for example, if you see, okay, with my research, let's compute the dish, and I have a score of that this score between 0 and 100%, and I can say, oh, it seems very low, 20%. So perhaps something is missing in my sample. Some dimension is underrepresented. And for example, in statistics, we have a tool that is called the spider web, and the spider web is able to go inside of the global score and to look, okay, which dimension is underrepresented? Is it the sex? Is it this variable? So we can produce a score for each of the components of the dish score and to see, okay, for example, the sex is a problem here. So perhaps I should try to recruit more women, or so it's an indication if your study, for example, is sufficiently diversified, and which dimension or dimensions are less represented. So we can play with that.
So when you are calculating a diversity score from 0 to 100%, what are you trying to match on? Are you trying to match on the diversity of HIV in the world, HIV in a country, HIV in a city? Like what are you trying to
Okay, so to keep it simple, because for the part of the data simulation, for example, as I will use the multivariate multinomial distribution, we need what we call in statistics parameters. So for example, the proportions of certain categories in my data sets. So for example, if sex is one of the selected variables from step 1, when I will generate data containing sex in the second step, I will to use the proportions of male and proportions of female to generate data sets. And for those proportions, for example, I will start with what is available in Statistics Canada, so only for Canada. And the goal of the user guide I will do for one of the contributions is to show how you can build your dish score if you're working in your country. When you do the simulations or when you do the step number 2 part, you will have to use the proportions of your country available in statistics of your country. So for now, to start simple, I will produce a dish score for Canada, because I will use the parameters, the proportions of the categories of my variables available in Canada. Because it's a good question, because we can do, okay, but for US and for France and for Portugal and for whatever you want. So the user guide will be here to guide people to do the same that I did for Canada, but for other countries.
Marina.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, but then there's a question from Anne Birchall that I'll read. I guess it's an interesting and complicated question, right? Because
I know.
talk about diversity, does it represent the actual HIV epidemic population? Whereas one of our challenges has always been is often clinical trials do recruit the proportion of women, for example, that are infected by HIV, but they are in the minority because they represent a smaller proportion of the total epidemic. So then, or do you match it to the Canadian population itself, where it's going to be obviously much more equal? But the question that I was interested in, I think it's very interesting because it gives you a measure or a score about the various studies, and then you can compare them across the types of studies for their level of diversity. But it doesn't necessarily answer the question of, can you have enough statistical power in a given study that's highly diverse, because of the subgroups are going to be potentially small to reach that level of diversity needed. And so there's another aspect to this, and I think your investigations in terms of how this is affected by sample size, I think are going to be very important, because you may have an extremely diverse small study, but you can't make any generalizations or any inferences to the subpopulations because there's just no power. So
exactly,
diversity is a goal, but it's not necessarily an objective to reaching the ends of having, research results that pertain to those populations. So it's sort of
yeah. And one of the challenges precisely is to define the target population. What is a population I want to represent? And that's not so easy. And after that, the dish is just a score, is just a descriptive statistics. So at this stage, I won't be able to, for example, to try to deduce a distribution for that dish. I don't know, to do some inference. I don't know if it is normal. I can do with the simulations, I can guess, I can try to guess all the histogram seems symmetric. I can do, for example, QQ plot. So I can try to somehow do a list or a broad list for the statistical properties of that dish, but they will be based only on empirical data, simulated data. Though, so it's not, I will not do a formal proof or okay, that score follows that distribution. And if you want to do confidence intervals and test hypothesis testing and so on, you have that distribution. So that's perhaps another step because it's like you said, it's a small and large at the same time project, and the project itself is very diverse because there are many ways of approaching that problem, and we have a lot of issues will arise. I know at step number 2, I'm aware of that. Yeah.
So, Serge, I really see this being more helpful when you're planning a study rather than analyzing a study. So say I wanted to do a study on, HPV vaccine in women. That's a CTN study. So I would see that your dish would tell me, okay, you need X number of women of this age, of this socioeconomic status, of this race in order to be able to show differences in vaccine efficacy between this and that. That's how I see it. And I think that the pharma companies could really benefit from something like this. They always, give this lip service, which always gives me grief. We're going to enroll 25% women. They never make it. But putting it up front, if you want to be able to show your drug works in this population, you need to have this many people in all these categories. And that's how I see it being helpful.
Yes, precisely. And in the second step, for example, the simulated data sets I will produce, they represent profiles. So it's a profile of a potential study. So even in the data simulated phase, we can already say, okay, for this type of profile, imagine that we have a study with this proportion of men and women, this proportion of racial ethnicities and so on. That's the dish score. Even if it is a fictional data set, it is possible. So with real data sets and real data, we can do the same exactly.
Great. So does anyone else, I don't see any questions in the chat, just Bertrand telling you did a great job. Is there any other comments, questions from anybody in the audience or anybody else on the panel?
I think just to follow up on Anne's question, and you've touched on it pretty much, Serge, but the idea of whether you could actually have tailored dishes for different reference populations that might be as
Exactly. If you define a certain target population, surely the dish will be different than for another target population, obviously.
Great. So I guess we haven't got any further questions. We'll thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. Excellent to have such a high-level statistical work being done within CTN postdoc, and we look forward to seeing how this plays out. There's other cohorts, so welcome you to contact the Canadian co-infection cohort, for example. Would be really interesting to apply it in that setting. We'll move on to our next presenter. This will be a presentation given by Jordan Sang, who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the BC Centre for Excellence in HIV/AIDS, and he's working with the Momentum Health Study. under the supervision of David Moore and Nathan Lachowski. He's really comes to us at the CTN with a strong background in public health and behavioral research, having done PhD studies in the United States in behavioral and community health sciences and specific certificates in LGBT health and wellness. And so his presentation today is entitled Examining Secondary Impacts of COVID-19 Pandemic on Syndemic Production and HIV among Gay, Bisexual, and Other Men who have sex with men in Vancouver, Canada. Welcome, Jordan.
Thanks, Marina. Let me just share my screen here first. All right. Oh, can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, great. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Jordan Sang. As Marina mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the BC Centre for Excellence in HIV/AIDS in Vancouver, Canada. And my supervisors are Dr. David Moore and Dr. Nate Lachowski. And today I'll be talking about some of the research which we found for my CTN postdoctoral fellowship so far. So a bit of background information. The secondary impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic may have lasting impacts, especially for those who are most affected. And I was specifically interested in gay and bisexual men. And so there's growing attitudes that suggest that COVID-19 be considered a syndemic, which disproportionately affects those who are already marginalized, as opposed to a singular pandemic. And so syndemic theory conceptualizes how multiple epidemics interact synergistically, which contribute to disease proliferation. And so I was specifically interested in gay and bisexual men because of early on in the pandemic, with the closure of sexual health clinics here in BC specifically, which are a primary care site for gay and bisexual men. And so preliminary data collected from gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men early on in the pandemic found that 86% reported stopping PrEP completely, with COVID-19 being considered the main reason. And 17% reported stopping PrEP, and they indicated that there was difficulty accessing PrEP during this time. So this study looks to examine the longitudinal impacts of COVID-19 on syndemic production and the implications for PrEP use among HIV-negative unknown gay and bisexual men in Vancouver, BC. So our objectives here were to assess trends of syndemic production and trends of PrEP interruptions among HIV-negative unknown GBM in Vancouver, as well as to assess the correlates of syndemic correlates for PrEP interruptions among HIV negative and unknown GBM in Vancouver. So in terms of our methods, so participants were recruited using respondent-driven sampling into the ENGAGE study. And so this is a longitudinal biobehavioral cohort of GBM. And this study is based in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. And baseline recruitment was from February 2017 to August 2019. Eligibility for the study was that participants had to be over 16 years of age or older, identify as a man, including trans men, live in Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal, and report sex with another man in the past 6 months. As well, they had to be recruited specifically into the study or be a C participant. However, this study only uses data from Vancouver, from the Vancouver site, because of our unique linkages with the BC HIV drug treatment program here in BC. And so we are, with these linkages, we are able to directly assess PrEP uptake and continuation. So follow-up analyses for this study include data from March 2018 to April 2021. And the reason why we used the March 2018 start date is because in BC in January 2018, PrEP became publicly funded, and March 2018 is 2 years pre-COVID-19. And so another important thing to note is that because of the pandemic, we had a closure of our study sites from March 2020 to September 2020. So I want to present here a few of our baseline sociodemographic results. So our total participants were 766 individuals. The median age was 34 years old. About 46% of our participants in this sample had an annual income of less than $30,000. About 48% of our participants identified as Canadian. The majority, 85.5%, identified as gay, and 94.3% identified as cisgender. Additionally, 73.4% were currently employed, and most of our participants, 84.5%, reported a greater than high school education. So looking at our syndemic trend results, I'm sorry, I think I missed a slide here. I think it skipped a slide. So I wanted to talk about measures and analyses. So for this analysis, for syndemic conditions, we looked at anxiety and depression, which are measured by the HAD scale. And so we used a dichotomous scale where scores of 11 or greater were considered moderate or severe, and scores 10 or less were considered normal or mild. We looked at interpersonal violence, IPV, and this was measured any at baseline, and then at follow-up visits, this was measured in the past 6 months. Polysubstance use, which looked at self-reported substances used in the past 6 months, if participants indicated 2 or more. And alcohol use was measured using the audit C scale, and scores of 4 or more were considered hazardous. For PrEP interruptions, we looked at participants who indicated that they stopped by letting their provider know, as well as if participants did not refill their PrEP prescriptions for at least 6 months after that they were due. And so for this analysis, we used univariable generalized linear mixed models, and we examined syndemic trends, as well as trends in PrEP interruptions. And we also applied a 3-level mixed effects logistic regression with RDS clustering, and looked at the individual as well as interaction effects of syndemics on PrEP use. Okay, so we went over the baseline, and now we'll talk about the syndemic trend results. So our study includes 766 participants reporting on 2,396 visits from March 2018 to April 2021. And what we found here is that depressive symptoms increased over the study period, particularly with a notable increase after the onset of COVID-19 in Canada. So when our study offices reopened in September 2020, we noticed that the scores increased after that period. However, we did notice a decreasing trend of polysubstance use, as well as hazardous alcohol use, interpersonal violence. And trends for anxiety were not significant. So looking at PrEP interruption trends, we found an increasing trend of PrEP interruptions over time. So we see here with our table that PrEP interruptions have increased over time. Looking at the start of our study period in March 2018, interruptions were only 1.2%. However, by the end of our study period, April 2021, there were almost 30% PrEP interruptions reported. So looking at our multivariable results, these are 828 visits from 280 HIV negative unknown participants from data from March 2018. And we found here that time period was significant. So the time period of September 2020 to April 2021 was associated with greater risk of PrEP interruptions. Additionally, participants who had moderate to severe scores for the HAD scale also had greater odds of interrupting PrEP use. We also found that experiences of IPV for participants who had those experiences, they had lower odds of PrEP interruptions. Additionally, participants who had a main partner had greater odds of reporting interruptions in PrEP use. However, participants who scored for PrEP eligibility at their study visits, and they met these criteria at the study visit, they had lower odds of PrEP interruptions compared to participants who didn't meet PrEP eligibility. And then lastly, participants who were older also had a lower risk of PrEP interruptions. So some conclusions that we found. for our syndemic findings. We did find increasing trends of depressive symptoms. However, we also found decreasing trends of hazardous alcohol use, polysubstance use, and interpersonal violence. We found that depressive symptoms were associated with increased odds of PrEP interruptions. As well, any experiences of IPV were associated with decreased odds of PrEP interruptions. We didn't find any other significant associations with other syndemic conditions, and there were no significant interaction effects that we found as well. So overall, we did find an increasing trend of PrEP interruptions over time, and by the end of our study period, 30% of GBM had a PrEP interruption at their visit date. As well, time period was associated with increased odds of PrEP interruption. So the period after COVID, September 2020 to April 2021, was associated with increased odds compared to pre-COVID, March 2018 to March 2020. And then lastly, and really importantly, GBM who met clinical eligibility for PrEP at their study visit were less likely to report PrEP interruptions than GBM who did not meet eligibility at their study visits. So this really told us that GBM who were most at risk and who were met eligibility for PrEP were less likely to interrupt PrEP treatment than those who didn't meet eligibility. So some limitations is that our study site closure from March 2020 to September 2020. However, a strength is that the direct linkages with the BC PrEP program, which can directly measure PrEP continuation and interruptions. And then a few takeaways. Future research should expand on our findings using qualitative research, as well as while PrEP interruptions are concerning, it did seem that those who are most at risk were less likely to interrupt treatment. And then lastly, with our depression finding, perhaps additional mental health services and targeted follow-up continuation should be synced together with PrEP continuation to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic for GBM. And then for myself, in terms of future work, I will be turning these analyses into manuscripts and be sending these to peer-reviewed journals. I'll also follow up with community-based knowledge translation. So I'm interested in looking at plain language summaries, community reports, as well as social media posts. And this was just part of the analyses for my CTN fellowship. So I also want to look at analyses for ART interruptions for GBM living with HIV, as well as time to restart analyses for GBM who interrupted their PrEP use, as well as look into future career opportunities and grant opportunities as well. And some references, and then lastly, acknowledgements.
Great, thank you very much, Jordan. Another very clear and interesting presentation. I'll get started with some questions. We have one from Marianne Harris, who was wondering whether PrEP interruptions in at least some cases could be appropriate, and a reflection that the GBM were following public health guidelines for COVID, for example. So it might not always be a bad sign. I guess that's to say if they were, staying home and not at risk as much because they weren't having encounters that would put them at risk.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and a reason why we wanted to look at PrEP eligibility in our multivariable model. So just because someone interrupted PrEP doesn't necessarily mean that that's a negative thing, because as we know, by looking at the PrEP eligibility, some people didn't meet eligibility for PrEP at their visits, meaning that sexual partners are sexual risk. So these individuals perhaps have had lower sexual risk, which is a reason why they stopped their treatment or PrEP treatment. And I think that following up these findings with qualitative research, which is currently being done in Engage, will really help triangulate our findings to show that these interruptions perhaps may not be a negative thing, especially for those who are most at risk for HIV.
I wondered myself if, so as I understand it, everyone in the sample did have PrEP at some point.
Yes.
Right. And so, and it corresponds with when PrEP became reimbursed. And so the first year onset, very low rates of interruption, possibly because people are new PrEP users mostly. And what would you think is the kind of natural history of PrEP interruption over time? As I think there's evidence that people who do start on PrEP, there's an attrition over the years. as you go on? And could some of the PrEP interruptions that you're seeing in the later time periods just be a reflection of just no longer being, regular on PrEP?
Yeah. I think that, as you mentioned, if we look at our table of our PrEP interruptions, we see that when this study started in March 2018, we had relatively few GBM who were on PrEP, and as time went on, these numbers grew. And so I think that, as you mentioned, when because of attrition and when individuals start PrEP, perhaps there are more interruptions over time. And I think that perhaps this is a really important reason why on-demand PrEP is useful as opposed to just the daily option for GBM, so that on-demand provides the option to use PrEP as risk may go up or down throughout these individuals' lives, as opposed to just taking PrEP daily, which they may not need PrEP daily.
Sharon, I think you have a question. You're muted though. You have to unmute.
Sorry about that. Sort of on the same line, and I think there's a lot of competing things here. As was indicated, with time, people tend to use less PrEP. If people were behaving public health, maybe they weren't being exposed. But on the other hand, clinically, syphilis rates were off the roof. So people were having sex. So I didn't see in your model anywhere, do you have any measure of sexual activity? And had that changed over this period of time, or of the development of STIs that would add to your analysis?
We didn't look at specifically sexual activity just because all the individuals who were in this model met the PrEP eligibility at the time. So these all met PrEP eligibility, and they had were associated with greater sexual risk. However, I think that it is an important point to look at. And the reason why we looked at PrEP eligibility at the study visit, again, to look at whether or not these individuals had their sexual risk at their visit in which they interrupted PrEP. Does that answer the question?
I think maybe along the same lines, Trevor Hart was asking, do you think that COVID-19 is also interrupt that kind of other usual syndemics that we see among GBM? And if so, why or how?
Yeah, so we actually were quite surprised in some of our trend findings for looking at the syndemic variables, specifically looking at polysubstance use, alcohol use, IPV. These all went down, which I hypothesized what might go up because of the pandemic, especially because of loneliness, isolation. Individuals may engage in more alcohol use, substance use. However, that was not the case, and I hypothesized that perhaps a reason why that is because of isolation, perhaps of reduced sexual encounters and experiences. Alcohol use and polysubstance use went down. And I'm still trying to figure out why or how IPV went down over time as well, and look into that. And I think that's important why we have qualitative research to follow up with this.
Yeah, because I think it sort of flies in the face of what all the national reporting is about, what's happening to people during a pandemic in terms of alcohol rates going up and intimate partner violence among women and heterosexual couples has been really highlighted as a big issue as part of the pandemic. So it is quite interesting finding.
Yeah, and we didn't find any trend for anxiety, which I also found surprising as well. I would have thought that anxiety rates would have gone up, especially after the onset of COVID, but we didn't find that.
I guess it speaks to why we need objective evidence in a well-designed study. So I think it's great that you've been able to share that with us today. And congratulations on this work, and look forward to see where it goes forward.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Jordan, and very interesting work. And we will move on. Our next speaker is CAHR Spence. CAHR previously was a postdoctoral scholar. She worked on a CIHR project that was Know Your Status. And she's worked a lot with the Indigenous communities, primarily in Saskatchewan. She got both her bachelor's and her master's and PhD degrees from the University of Saskatchewan. So she's now changed teams and is now working with Dr. Klein. And today she's going to speak to us about a new project, comparative care models hospital-based, in community, and on reserve, presenting HIV care cascades in these clinical sites in Saskatoon, or in Saskatchewan, pardon me. So welcome, Kara.
Thank you, Sharon. Here, let me just share my screen. And actually, the title that you shared is a title of a virtual poster presentation that's in the slide in the CAHR conference. So I'll be presenting my postdoc work. And the project title is Under the Covers: The Truth and Reconciliation of HIV Infection Amongst Indigenous Women in Saskatchewan. This project, I didn't exactly switch teams as much as merge teams, and Marina Klein is my supervisor, co-supervised by Stuart Skinner at the University of Saskatchewan. So who am I? So I'm Kara Spence. Thanks for the introduction. I was born and raised here in Saskatchewan, in the middle of the Canadian prairies on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. This work was also done in two of the other treaty territories in Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 and Treaty 10. I'm a 5th generation French-Scottish settler, 4th generation feminist, 1st generation scholar, and I'm a mother, sister, auntie, ally, and steward of this land. My daughter is Indigenous, and 3 of my 4 sisters are also Indigenous. One is a Mohawk in Northern Ontario, and the other 2 are Plains Cree from here in Treaty 6. And those women help me keep it real, and their mothers also help me to support me and my work. So overview of HIV in Saskatchewan, I think many of you know sort of the pressing issue or pressing unique situation we have here with HIV in Saskatchewan. The epidemic rates are the highest in the country, more than 4 times the national average. But limited research has been conducted in Saskatchewan, and this is for various reasons. Data sovereignty is really important in our treaty, amongst our treaty people. So any research that's done that's specific with Indigenous people needs to be in collaboration and in partnership with the Indigenous population involved. So those relationships are really important. The other component is the clinicians that work in HIV in Saskatchewan are really, I'll say, overburdened. They almost don't really have the time to invest in the rigor that this kind of research involves. I'm primarily, well, I would say, I would identify as a community-based researcher. So, and all my work for the past 20 years has been community-based. So I have a lot of these established relationships with Indigenous communities. We've seen the exponential rise in cases. In 2002, we had 26 cases in Saskatchewan. In 2009, roughly around 230. And the number here, 3,000 in 2020. Well, we're north of 3,000 now in 2022. So our numbers we're seeing, and we'll start testing again now that COVID, some of the testing will be more available, but we are seeing that J curve again at that high rates. 45% of these cases are within Saskatoon, and 85% of the diagnoses are within the Indigenous population. Recently, we've seen the shift. So I've been working in HIV in Saskatchewan since 2012. And at that time, the primary risk factor was amongst men, 35 to 45-year-old IV drug use was the primary risk factor. But we're seeing a pretty distinct shift now away from IV drug use as a primary risk factor and shifting towards sexual transmission in general and higher rates among women. So in short, we really see a deepening of the social determinants of HIV infection here in Saskatchewan, younger at diagnosis, higher rates of new diagnoses in women, disproportionately Indigenous population, and the poor health outcomes are really amplified by food insecurity, unstable, unsafe, inaccessible housing, and restrictions in not only support services, but also social and relational care. So my project objectives are to create a comprehensive clinical database for Saskatchewan for HIV and hepatitis C population, to conduct a gender analysis on the cascade and health outcomes in 3 clinical settings: the acute care, hospital-based, community-based care, community clinic, and on-reserve care. And I'm looking to identify the critical vulnerabilities for Indigenous women identified through gaps in the cascade of care, in reported case studies, and collected lived experiences amongst women. And of course, reflections and interviews from clinical and support providers, decision makers, and Indigenous leadership. And I'm looking to recommend engagement and care approaches to better support the infected and at-risk populations in Saskatchewan. So progress to date, as community-based, if you're a community-based reacher, you know how important it is to be really involved in the community and have your community invested in your work. So that we've completed the comprehensive HIV clinical database for Saskatoon, and the HIV clinical database for on-reserve communities has also been pulled together. HCV, we're still ironing out all of those numbers. Dr. Skinner, that my co-supervisor, he's the specialist, ID specialist in Saskatchewan that provides mobile or on-reserve clinical care. To strengthen, I've been able to not only strengthen relationships with the clinical and community-based organizations, providers, care providers, and service providers in Saskatchewan, but also with each other. So, like I said, I've been working in this area for quite some time in Saskatchewan, and within this past year, I've seen great strides in the connections between clinicians and between groups and working together of the CBOs. Strengthening the existing and ongoing relationships with Saskatchewan Indigenous leaderships and on-reserve communities, leadership in academia as well as in governments. And we've established sort of a dream team of clinical and research a team to respond to the HIV and pregnancy rates in Saskatchewan. So really excited to move that work forward as well. We've established an Indigenous-led peer mentorship network in Saskatchewan, or in Saskatoon, Regina, and on-reserve communities. They're called the Wellness Warriors, and there's their logo there. I'm really proud of them and the work that they're doing. And we've commenced program evaluation for the models of care in Saskatoon. So let's turn to care in Saskatoon. In my virtual poster, you'll see the 2019, 20, 21, 22 cascade of cares and all the demographics of the clinics in Saskatoon. For this talk, I just want to pull out the most recent. So this is the care cascade, up until 2 days ago. And, but really the care cascade is pretty consistent over the years. PLP, so that's the dark red. PLP is the acute care setting. It's based in the Royal University Hospital. And the light red is the Westside Community Clinic. And Westside Community Clinic is located in the west side of Saskatoon. It's a community-based clinic, primary care, and it's sort of in the hub of the population. It's accessible, and it's got, as I said, primary care, methadone prescribers. We've got a pharmacy there, and it's right in the heart of the community. So side by side, you can see some of the difference in the care models and the outcomes of the patients. So the first bar is the total charts or patients in each of the EMRs. And the second in the active. So the active is those that have seen an HIV-related appointment in the last 2 years. PLP, so we'll just talk about PLP first. So 50% or 51% of their patient population are active or have had appointment in the last 2 years. And of that 51%, 57% of that, only 57% are engaged in care. So roughly around 28 or 29% of the full 100%. Of that, 45% are on ARVs and only 31% are virally suppressed. So there's a few notes that we can see from that model. It's an acute care setting. It may not address the needs or the demands of a patient population. It's a different kind of, you've got to go to admission or go to registration, and then you have to go here and then go there and sit and wait, and there's a lot of exposure and a wait time for the patient seeking care in the hospital. So if they're working with addictions, that could be challenging. And if there's any sort of stigma, there's all sorts of stuff that happens when you're seeking care in the hospital. With this patient population, clearly it's not the most ideal model of care. West Side, on the other hand, widely accessible. The doors stayed open even during COVID. Of the full patient population, 70% have had an HIV-related appointment in the last 2 years. And of those that are seeking care, 88% remain engaged in care. So, there's lots of ways to capture this patient population. They come in for, various, when I pull the data, their appointment data, thousands of lines of appointment data. So they come in for all sorts of reasons. So lots of opportunity to engage the clients in this community-based model. 73% are on ARVs, and viral suppression does drop down to 50% of those active in care are virally suppressed. So that speaks to need for ongoing monitoring and just adherence, various issues around adherence. On reserve, I just showed over time. Again, it's fairly consistent how it looks. The numbers are creeping up slowly, but it's fairly consistent in the cascade of care. So, a little over 80% are on ARVs, but it does drop down to 60% that become virally suppressed. And that speaks to the migrant nature of people on reserve. They move on and off, fairly fluid between urban and reserve. There's lots of other pressing issues on reserve, addiction and violence, trauma, death. There's a lot of social pressures on reserve, which can contribute to adherence as well. So age by gender, this is an important slide to note. So the dark red is the female, light red or pink is the male. And what you see is 49% of the women diagnosed with HIV are childbearing years between 20 and 39 years old. And the majority of the males are older, 50 plus. So you got younger women and older men. I did my PhD work in East Africa, and this is very similar with HIV and early pregnancies among women. This is very indicative of what we saw in that situation or that context as well. So when you have younger women, older men, that's often alludes to power imbalances or transactional or survival sex. So this split in gender is an important indicator of what's happening on the ground in HIV in Saskatoon. So let's talk a little bit about HIV and women in Saskatchewan. So 46% of new diagnoses were women in this last year. That's an increase from 23% from the 2018 to 2019, 32% from 2019 to 2020, and now it's hiked up to 46%. 82% is of those new diagnoses are within this childbearing years, and 94% of that population is of Indigenous ancestry. And we've also seen some spikes in HIV and pregnancy. So in the 10 years from 2007 to 2017, we had 84 HIV pregnant women. 90% of them, that's an important note, were in foster care as children. But in the 5 years between 2017 and 2022, 139 HIV prenatal women were cared for by the clinics in Saskatoon. All pregnant women are cared for by the clinics in Saskatoon, the specialists in Saskatoon. 8 of these were diagnosed in pregnancy, and we had no perinatal transmission since 2017. They had incredible care, complex needs, but a really good care team. But in March 2020, we were all devastated, that 2 babies were born with HIV in Saskatchewan. One, we suspect a seroconversion because the mother has no viral load, but the baby was born. And the second baby, the mom came in labor. She sought no prenatal care, and because she said that she didn't want anyone to know. So there's a lot of issues around stigma, fear, and just seeking access care. So the next steps in this work, I'd like to do a comparative analysis at the national level so we get a better idea. We tend to look at our microcosm, but I think for advocacy and for even political pressure, if you know much about Saskatchewan, if you look, when we do the federal election, it's all blue right here in the center. So that speaks to some of our political priorities. So we tend to be fairly insular when we look at our HIV, but I'd like to take that out to the national level and present that to our provincial governments so that they see how we compare to our neighbors and our national friends. The pregnancy cohort, we have Sanctum 1.5 here in Saskatoon, which does incredible work. It's transitional care for perinatal mothers and their babies. So we've got a really nice community, but we will want to look at some of these mom and baby outcomes with these increased rates and the support services available to our women. The collection of case studies and documentation of lived experiences is the focus for year 2 of this work. The qualitative, my favorite part, the qualitative piece, which will be the next step, the next focus. The strengthening of the peer work, pivotal. This is really hard work and really important, critical work for this patient population, and seeking the appropriate remuneration for this work, for the peer work. Completion and dissemination of the program evaluation of the care models in Saskatoon, and provide recommendations to the health region and to the provincial government, just to identify, I've spoken to both of the clinics together and separately, and they tend to, there might yet to demonstrate, but the allocation of resources might not be appropriate given some of the demands on the 2 clinics. And there may be a better way to provide HIV care, specialized care in the hospital, community-based care in the community clinic might be a more appropriate way to sort of divide up the patient population and be a little bit more patient-centered in where the care is delivered. And of course, the ongoing, but we need data and evidence for to advocate for the support services that we need. So the transitional teams, we have a really strong transitional team from hospital to community called HEART. And that was supported by pharma as a joint demonstration project, and then picked up by the health region, as well as transitional from new mothers into Sanctum. And again, that was a demonstration project that was then shown to have value and was picked up by the SHA. So what we'd like to see is a transitional team in community. We need much more outreach and meeting people and clients, patients, people at risk where they're at in community. We have actually successfully been awarded some funds to train and certify our peer mentors so that they can be integrated formally into the circle of care and work directly with healthcare providers to better support patients. Increase outreach, safe spaces, including women-only spaces. Harm reduction, our provincial budget that was just released had cut harm reduction funding, so we're back to fundraising for harm reduction. So we need to make a better case for why that is not a wise decision. and supportive social care. We have our wellness warriors hold support groups, and there's so much demand for those sharing circles that it was one and quickly became 2, and now it's 4, and plus 2 more men only groups. So this social care is really important in this population. And update the best practice guidelines to reflect the need for trauma-informed and cultural responsiveness for HIV care in Saskatchewan and beyond. So I'd just like to acknowledge I'm greatly so grateful for the funding to do this work from the CTN Postdoc Fellowship Award. And I'm really grateful to be able to move on to year 2 to flesh out the rest of this work. And the mentorship and support of Dr. Klein and Dr. Skinner, it's really so critical and so important. I really appreciate it. Collaborators at Positive Living Program, that's the Royal University Hospital and West Side Community Clinic. Their staff and their clinicians have just opened their doors, their charts, their hearts, their minds to support me in this work, and I really appreciate everything that they do. Of course, Saskatchewan Indigenous leadership, both within the academy and within the community. And the wellness warrior peer mentors. My work, I really couldn't do my work without them. I'm not Indigenous and I don't live with HIV. So they are the front line. They do a lot of the data collection. They'll do the interviews in year 2 and collection of narratives with women living with HIV. We've done some capacity building and some research, community-based research assistant kind of work with them, how to collect data, do interviews, and this sort of stuff. So the wellness warriors are really pivotal to my work and to the care for the patients living with HIV in Saskatchewan. And that's everything. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Kara, for a very powerful piece of work. And I think we would all like to congratulate you on the many steps that you have made of being able to integrate yourself within this community and to enable this community to start to trust and to start to participate in research. And I know that it's been a focus of the CTN for many years to try and be able to help to allow research to happen in these communities. So you've made some important steps and we look forward to seeing your work. And I think it's incredibly powerful for you to try and determine the optimal ways to deliver care to this community. So I have some questions. There's some coming in through the chat and I have a few questions around the women primarily, again, my focus. And you alluded in part of your presentation that these women, didn't want to tell. If they want to hide it, do you think your peer research associates will be successful in reaching out to these women or not?
Yeah, that's the way in, without question. The level of trust that's needed, not only there's a well-founded distrust of the health system, the peer mentors, the wellness warriors are the critical link between the patient and getting clinical care. They not only facilitate the appointments, maybe provide transportation, but and connections and links, but they're their allies. They're there to translate what's being said to them, to support them, to advocate for the women. It's very disempowering position to be in, and with a mentor or someone on your side, it helps to build that strength, and also the outreach. So with more peers on the ground, it not only helps their own healing and recovery and where they're at, but it also extends the reach of that social care. So if we know someone might be expecting or might be positive and at risk, then the peers have access to connect with these women, far superior to anyone in clinic, or even, you know, a warm-hearted person like myself. You just don't have that same kind of connection or reach. It's really about relational care.
Great. There's a question from Madeleine Duran. She is commenting on your graph on the cascade of care and wonders, would you say the reason that fewer people are provided care on reserve versus in Saskatoon is due to there's less people living on reserve, or is it reflect the lack of availability of services on reserve so that people have to go to Saskatoon to get them?
Well, our on-reserve care is really good. So, you know, the suppression rates, you know, there's an adherence issues, but, you know, that tends to be social issues. But the engagement in care is really high. It's like 80% or so. And that has very much to do with the commitment and devotion of you know, the Wellness Wheel and Dr. Skinner's team. They you know, drive and provide care right on reserve, but also the health clinics on reserve have worked with Dr. Skinner and his team in partnership for a number of years now, where they provide a lot of that continuity of care, especially during the COVID and the lockdowns, where we weren't able to go to community, we could connect virtually. So a lot of that care is being provided by community on reserve. And certainly, as far as the migrant nature, you know, there just isn't a lot of services provided, and I don't know if there's really any lab provided either. So you kind of have to leave for many reasons, not just groceries. So yeah, definitely the lack of resources and services on reserve contribute.
So of the people that initiate antiretroviral therapy, have quite a bit of fall off in terms of those that are suppressed. And have you explored the reasons? Is it cost? Is it adverse events? Is it, I don't trust this? Is it other social determinants of health? Have you been able to evaluate that?
Good question. I would only be presumptive if I were to respond, and that's a good question to ask. You know, when we delve a little deeper in some of the qualitative work, certainly social determinants is a big factor. I've also heard, because I also work with traditional healers, and from that perspective, there's some traditional medicines that people want to try or prefer to try or to use. So there is, you know, an importance of just relationship building. It really is about relationship building. If they trust you, or they trust, so Dr. Skinner has a lot of great success with his engaging his clients because they just trust him and they trust his team. But you know, the suppression, I would suggest, is largely social determinant.
And another question is what are the attitudes and practices of these women around breastfeeding?
That I don't know, and that I'm excited to find out. The pregnancy study, I'm quite, it's a bit of an add-on, but it's not, it's women, HIV and Women in Saskatchewan, so it still fits within the scope. I'm really looking forward to working with that patient population and that team. We've kind of been, like I say, it's a dream team. I'm really excited to start that work with them. So we'll find out. Breastfeeding will be an interesting, traditionally it's practiced. So before colonialization, like, you know, certainly colonization put a dent not only in Africa, but also locally. There's some disjunction there with breastfeeding, but it is a practice. Yeah, we'll find out.
But it was very, very exciting to see the decrease in the risk of transmission in pregnancy. I mean, you know, I think a lot of places had a few relapses through the pandemic, and your observations may not be, you know, different than any other setting just now.
One of the other things I think might be interesting to bring up, Karen, I know it came up when you looked at some of the other communities, is really the importance of the continuity of the teams that are there, and how just disrupting, you know, nurses or people in the community that have known and trusted for many years can have, just a change in personnel can have a dramatic effect on these things. So it's there's so many factors that often have to go in. It's not, that because of the importance of those relationships, if those relationships get disrupted for any reason, and obviously COVID is one of those big disruptions, but turnover in community or reallocation of nurses to do other tasks, for example, against it has been a big issue.
It's huge. Yeah, that is huge.
So Kara, there's a question here from Stephen. He asks, have you ever thought of a transitional reintegrations interventions program and service with connecting organizations providing everything from medical education, life skills, disability, and housing, having that kind of umbrella organization can group together and have a peer navigator to redirect people to where they need to go?
Yes. So that's the community transition team that I'd like to see. Well, not just me, this is really coming from the website clinic, that what they see they need is this community transition team where when people are in community, there's this team that can link people. HART, the hospital community transition team, has, within 3 months to get people suppressed. They get them, housed and cared for and suppressed very quickly, very quick. So we need the same level of support in community. So people who are sort of lost to follow-up or lost to care have that go-to team to connect them to whatever it is that they need and become quickly suppressed, just like HART.
Having spent time in Africa, you probably had the opportunity to observe these microeconomies and providing women with support to make their own businesses. Has anybody attempted that in Saskatchewan?
Well, I'm more of a cooperative than a microcredit, just because it's a different orientation. So I guess that's a different discussion, but I'm not really sure. I can't answer that. I can see their value for, economic development, small economic development and income generation. But there's certainly work being done in community and in groups, in Indigenous groups.
Yeah, there's been some fabulous presentations at the HIV and Women's conference of them using this in Africa and then tying it to an educational program to help then educate about the importance of adherence to antiretrovirals and all of those activities. There's some very interesting programs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting.
Okay, there's another question here from Allison. She says, I may have missed it in your overview slide. You share that 85% of the diagnoses are within the Indigenous populations. Are these referring to new diagnosis or all diagnosis?
All diagnoses.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be fair to. Well, the new diagnoses are pretty reflective of the overview. Actually, I feel like I better just double check that. Let me quickly just look, because I think that was in relation to the new. Those are new diagnoses, but the overall prevalence of HIV in Saskatchewan is fairly close to that number.
Terrific. Okay, are there any other comments or questions? If not, we'd like to thank you very much for an interesting presentation, and we look forward to your project results as you move on.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Much, Sarah. Great job. And now we get to move on to our next presenter, who is Josh Edward, who had his bachelor's and master's from the United States, from the University of Utah, followed by a PhD at the University of British Columbia. And he actually comes with extensive experience in public health and infectious disease, with working for over a decade in sexual health, HIV and STD programming and community-based research through Atlantic Regional Research Manager of the REACH 3.0 Center for REACH. And so he's going to present to us today on It's Time for an Update, exploring uptake factors influencing PrEP and PEP doxycycline use in gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men and trans clinical trial enrollees. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you, Marina, and I will share my screen if somebody enables that for me.
Be able to.
Josh, do you see the share screen button?
Oh,
at the
there it
bottom
is.
of your Zoom window?
We're good. Okay, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joshua Edward, and I'm here just to present my postdoctoral fellowship study update, which stands for Exploring Uptake Factors Influencing PrEP and PEP doxycycline use in gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, and trans clinical trial enrollees. I'm joining you today from Chibuktuk Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral enunciated territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I acknowledge that I'm a settler on these lands, now so-called Dartmouth and Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I'm completing my CTN postdoctoral fellowship at the BC Centre for Disease Control under the supervision of Dr. Troy Grennan. So first, a little bit of background on my research topic. First and foremost, there's really a growing epidemic of bacterial STIs worldwide, including syphilis, chlamydia, and gonorrhea. The World Health Organization now estimates that there are nearly 1 million people infected with a curable STI daily. And similarly, concerning trends have been observed here in Canada, with increases of over 160% seen in bacterial STIs over the last decade. And in Canada, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, GBMSM, including trans individuals identifying as GBMSM and also GBMSM living with HIV, are disproportionately impacted by bacterial STIs. These same groups are also disproportionately impacted by repeat infections of bacterial STIs and complications from undiagnosed or late diagnosed bacterial STIs. For example, neurosyphilis and the complications that can be associated with untreated LGV. These bacterial STI increases have really been taking place despite positive developments around testing, treatment, and other prevention methods. So it really just might be time to consider new tools to prevent bacterial STI transmission and the associated risks and health impacts. And my postdoctoral work here is a continuation of previous research that I've worked on with Dr. Grennan and part of a larger clinical trial investigating the use of doxycycline for pre and post exposure prophylaxis for the prevention of bacterial STIs. So doxy, PEP, and PrEP, a brief history of clinical trials with great acronyms. So first, it was DUDES, where it all began. And there's the full study title of DUDES. So in DUDES, we enrolled 52 participants and investigated the use of both HIV PrEP and daily doxycycline for syphilis PrEP. Participants were assigned to deferred or immediate treatment arms and received either 6 or 12 months of doxycycline respectively. All participants did, however, receive 12 months of HIV PrEP. Of those 52 participants that were enrolled, 20 cases of STIs were reported in 24 weeks of follow-up, so 16 in the deferred arm and 4 in the immediate arm. And compared to the immediate arm, the deferred arm experienced increased incidence of syphilis, chlamydia, and gonorrhea. So we definitely saw with DUDES, which took place a few years ago now, that there was some promising evidence that doxycycline could actually work to prevent bacterial STIs. That led us to DADS, which really was about expanding and focusing the research. So when I say expanding, we expanded the trial to look also at individuals who are living with HIV. And when I say focusing the research, of course, we weren't looking at preventing HIV. We were really just looking at prevention of syphilis with oral doxycycline. So DADS is actually still currently underway. It's a prospective, double-blind, randomized, controlled, multi-center pilot trial of daily doxycycline versus placebo for the prevention of syphilis among GBMSM living with HIV. As with DUDES, the sample size is 52 participants who are being recruited from clinical sites in Vancouver and Toronto, and who will receive either daily doxycycline or placebo for 48 weeks. And again, DADS is currently enrolling in both those sites. And those two studies really did lay the foundation, I think, for the current DISCO trial and my update sub-study. So DISCO, I would say, is bigger, better, broader, and has the best acronym. DISCO will enroll a total of 47 participants who will be recruited from 9 clinical sites. So Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Hamilton, Ottawa, and Montreal. The participants will be separated into 3 arms in DISCO. The STI PrEP arm will take 100 milligrams of doxycycline daily. The STI PEP arm will take 200 milligrams of doxycycline within 24 to 72 hours after an at-risk sexual encounter. So for example, condomless or oral sex. and the control standard of care arm will undergo routine STI screening and care, sexual health and STI education, condoms, risk reduction counseling, etc. And then update is really about looking at what some of the non-clinical impacts are happening for participants in the DISCO trial. So not necessarily just the prevention of STIs, but how taking doxycycline either as PEP or PrEP is really transforming individuals' sexual health care, sexual behaviors, and their sex lives. So GoDisco, www.godisco.ca is our study website. Just in the interest of time, I won't necessarily redirect there, but you can go there if you want. So on DISCO, the research question is among 447 sexually active adult GBMSM who have a history in the previous 12 months of at least one adequately treated bacterial STI, is the use of either doxycycline PrEP or PEP an efficacious and safe intervention for the prevention of a new bacterial STI over 15 months of follow-up? And we hypothesize that doxycycline will lead to a 70% reduction in incident bacterial STI rates in the intervention arm based on doxy, PEP, and PrEP data from the previously completed trials. So DISCO does build on encouraging finding from two smaller studies, not even dudes and dads, but studies that were previously completed in the United States and Canada. However, neither of those trials were adequately powered to fully address the critical questions around doxycycline and STI prevention. So DISCO is really going to help us determine whether these interventions could help prevent STIs and, following associated complications, harms, and could also help us understand questions around acceptability. Of course, there's some balancing of risk and reward anytime you're working on a clinical trial. So there's the skeletal formula for doxycycline. So as I previously mentioned, there's an unprecedented magnitude of bacterial STI infections in GBMSM in Canada and around the world. Decades worth of existing prevention efforts, including those that have expanded and evolved, such as testing, have really just not been enough. So with doxycycline, we have a really good candidate that has been used extensively in other medical applications, has been studied in other clinical trials for other uses for decades. We know it's generally a very safe antibiotic. We know who should not take it, and we know what its side effects are and how they can be managed. That most of the time, those are fairly minimal. Of course, we also know that it's a great candidate for this type of trial because it's also used currently to treat bacterial STIs. Sorry, I need to go back. There we go. I did just want to add that even though we do believe it's a very safe medication for use, and that's what inspired us to consider using doxycycline in this trial, there is, of course, the risk that's always associated in any clinical trial. And here, one of the biggest risks could be antimicrobial resistance. So just share that in developing the application, Troy and our team did a systematic review and did find some evidence that there could be some increased burden of tetracycline resistance in some of the subgingival, gastrointestinal, and upper respiratory normal flora. But the data that was found on antimicrobial resistance and the tetracyclines was generally pretty poor. So we just definitely feel like a more robust study is needed. So part of the DISCO trial is definitely also about, the rigorous multifaceted evaluation of antimicrobial resistance amongst trial participants, and to evaluate whether that is resistance is happening in both common bacterial flora or diagnosed STI pathogens. So with Update, it's really about looking beyond just that clinical significance, as I said. I hope to capture some of the impacts of doxy, PEP, and PrEP beyond just prevention. I would say some of the ideas for this study really started when I was working with Troy as the research coordinator on dudes. And just from getting to know some of the participants and hearing their stories. So, for example, I would say that all of the participants and dudes were pretty interested in preventing syphilis, but sometimes the reasons that they shared about that interest were maybe different than what we might have predicted. For example, it wasn't uncommon to hear some of the participants and dudes talk about how much they really disliked the injection treatments for syphilis infection, and that they would kind of avoid having to take those shots ever again in their lifetime, including that, while sexually active, they would much rather take a pill every day than ever have to take injections again. So just considering some of those motivations and how our understandings of treatment can kind of like differ sometimes, in comparison to what the community thinks of treatment, really got me thinking about the need to qualitatively flesh out what we're doing here. It's really just exploring, what are the impacts on sexual behavior of enrolling in the clinical trial? What are some of the current systematic barriers and facilitators in accessing sexual health care? How do those barriers and facilitators really relate to uptake of doxy for bacterial STI, PEP, and PrEP? And then also looking at how some of the specific impacts of COVID-19 pandemic and related shutdowns impacted sexual behaviors and sexual health. Update is a mixed method study design. So primarily qualitative, looking at individual and possibly small group interviews, and then with some quantitative components of secondary analysis of affiliated data, such as, from the DISCO trial or national data sources like SexNow. But really 25 to 40 one-on-one semi-structured interviews with both GBM-SM and trans individuals that will be recruited from the DISCO trial after they've completed 9 months of enrollment. So my hypothesis, which shares with DISCO, of course, that using doxycycline as PEP and PrEP will lead to a significant decrease in bacterial STI rates in the intervention arm. But I'm also looking at the associations with measurable impacts on participant sexual health, including the need for a decision to access bacterial STI testing, treatment, and alternative prevention methods. And secondarily, that the COVID-19 pandemic and associated restrictions and closures will have had measurable impacts on participant sexual health, including the need for an ability to access HIV and bacterial STI testing, treatment, and prevention tools and resources. For update, my primary research questions are, what are the current systemic barriers and facilitators confronting GBM-SM and trans women seeking STI testing, treatment, or information on new prevention tools, including doxycycline for STI, PEP, and PrEP? And how do these barriers and facilitators influence uptake of these new biomedical prevention innovations? And in what specific ways does doxycycline for STI, PEP, and PrEP impact sexual health behaviors? So including bacterial STI transmission, accessing testing, utilizing other prevention tools and methods, types of sexual activity, and types and numbers of sexual partners. And what unique impacts, including both positive and negative impacts, has the COVID-19 pandemic had on HIV and other STI testing options for GBM-SM and trans women, both HIV positive and HIV negative? Study timeline. If you see, we're kind of in a bit of a holding pattern. DISCO is just getting up and rolling. So Vancouver and Troy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe is actually going to be recruiting and enrolling any day now. And then the other sites that I mentioned across the country are kind of rolling on as they get their contract signed, basically. So because I do have to wait 9 months, I can start kind of recruiting in the Vancouver site immediately, but I couldn't start enrolling anybody until later this kind of winter. After which time I will complete the study visits and interviews, and then do all the data coding, analysis, manuscript writing, and publishing. And just my acknowledgements. So the DISCO study is funded by CIHR Canadian HIV Trials Network, CTN 329. It's also supported by the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. I, of course, am supported by a CTN Postdoctoral Fellowship Award, and did definitely want to take a second and give a special shout out to Dr. Troy Grennan, who I've known since way back when I was working as a community partner on some of his studies, then as a research coordinator on Dudes and Dads, and now as a CTN postdoc under his supervision. So dreams really can come true, folks. Troy, you've consistently challenged me to think about research in new ways, and I just want to thank you so much, Dr. G. And that is my presentation. So if anyone has any questions.
Yes, thank you, Joshua. It's going to create, I think, a lot of interest. And I don't know if it's you or Troy, but you definitely have the winning acronyms for your studies. And I think people are appreciating that in the chat as well. So thank you very, very much for an excellent presentation. I think it's going to be very exciting to see this trial. I think there's a point of clarification actually from Madeleine just about the arms of the DISCO study. I think you mentioned it, but just to repeat, whether it's designed to compare PEP, PrEP, and standard of care or placebo arm. It's powered to compare those three arms or the combination of PEP and PrEP.
It's 3-arm, and Troy, you can jump in if I'm incorrect there, but yes, looking at PEP, PrEP, and then just standard of care.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know why I have the capacity to talk because I see no one else can, but I'll take it. Yeah, so that's right. It's 3 arms, and to compare each two, like the 3 together.
Great. And Anne Birchall is asking, are there specific directional changes in sexual behavior, attitudes, or experiences that you might hypothesize will be observed while taking PrEP or PEP? And she's also asking about things like sexual satisfaction, for example.
Yeah, I think that some of the things that I would personally anticipate coming out is that I think that Doxy, STI, PEP, and PrEP could really be kind of like a liberating tool for some individuals. It could allow some individuals to have types of sex that they might have been previously afraid to have in the past. Again, just because not necessarily of the type of sex it is, but because of fear of having to get to treatment for the types of sex that they want to have. I mean, it really, like, I can't say it enough, but the dudes participants hated the syphilis injections. It was just something that I, as research coordinator, hear a lot about, the treatment resistance. And so I think that's one thing. I think, and what I'm also interested in though is some of that also unanticipated? Does it have unanticipated outcomes? And so are individuals having types of sex that they might be pursuing that aren't necessarily leaving them fulfilled because they're not doing things like they're no longer asking participants sexual health histories or getting to know partners because they feel like those kinds of things they're allowed to kind of like take a shortcut because they're on doxycycline and, kind of covering their own bases, but not needing to spend some of the time getting to know a partner and including their sexual health, sexual interests, etc.
Sharon, I think you have a question. Yeah. Mute, you're on mute.
I can't help but think that Daryl had something to do with all of these acronyms. It smells of Daryl as well. But anyway, my question or one of my thoughts is, while you're waiting for your participants to get to the stage where you can do the interviews that you want for your part of this project, might it be useful to do similar types of groups or questionnaires in the people who don't want to participate to understand, what they think is not right, and then use those questions to explore in your group who do accept the protocol?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm actually working with an undergraduate with Troy, and he is interested in we're putting together some similar research questions that we'll use at BC CDC for individuals who aren't enrolled in DISCO around whether or not they would be interested in things like Doxy, STI, PEP, and PrEP. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah,
But I'm suggesting even do people who don't want to take it and explore why.
Oh, yeah. Nope, exactly. Yep. I think that's definitely essential.
Yeah, I think in both cases, it's going to be really informative in terms of the implementation of such an intervention once the results of the trial are available, so that if it does indeed show that the impact that you are hypothesizing, it's really going to be about that next step about how do we actually educate and give information to people who might now have this as an option, and what are the potential advantages or benefits that they could have from it based on what people who've experienced actually doing it are reporting. So I think it's
exactly
adds a richness to that study that goes beyond the simple trial. Yeah. Anybody else in the audience have questions? There's plenty of time to ask.
I guess the trial is placebo controlled, is that correct?
Disco is not. DADS has a placebo arm. Disco is STI prep, STI PEP, and then standard of care.
Was there a reason why not? Money and time.
I guess it's hard to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been incredibly complex, right? So you would have had to do this like triple dummy kind of like with multiple pill. It would have been like a mess. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess you get your efficacy estimate from the second study. Yeah. Okay, I'll turn it over. Thank you very much. Another
Absolutely.
excellent presentation. I think, you know, it's really amazing to see the work of the fellows this far. And I'm going to turn it to Sharon to introduce our last presenter of the day.
Yes, and so we do have one of our second year fellows who's going to be presenting at this session this year. I think many of you have had the opportunity to meet Elizabeth King before. Elizabeth King is an MD and she's doing her postdoctoral fellowship in Vancouver. And she also has had an interest in women's health and in particular issues related to the menopause. And her presentation today, which I've had the opportunity to hear in a couple of forums recently, is exploring the menopause transition for women living with HIV. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you everybody for staying in there and hanging in there for the last presentation of the day. And also, I just want to give a sincere hats off to my colleagues because I've been very impressed at the degree and the amount of work that you have accomplished and just the diversity of research that's been shared today. And so I have the pleasure of sharing the work that I've done in the last year and a half throughout my postdoctoral fellowship with CTN. And today I'll talk about characterizing and treating menopausal symptoms for women living with HIV. And I'd like to give a very, very warm thank you to my supervisors, Dr. Melanie Murray and Dr. Mona Lutfi. I just wish to begin by gratefully acknowledging that this research was conducted on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So to begin with, why are menopausal symptoms important? And so I see this as an important area of study because it really intersects two healthcare priorities for women living with HIV. In 2013, the UNAIDS made a call to action to focus attention on aging with HIV and for researchers to better understand this process. In addition, a bit more recently, there's been a real call for advocacy and action on maintaining health-related quality of life for people living with HIV. And so I see menopausal symptoms, as I mentioned, sitting at the intersect of these two. So as women living with HIV grow older, we're going to be seeing increasing numbers entering the menopause. And as they do, many women will be experiencing menopausal symptoms, and these symptoms can significantly impair quality of life. And so we're seeing a shifting age demographic for people living with HIV in general. And so now over 50% of Canadians living with HIV are now over the age of 50. And so for women, that means that many women living with HIV either have entered or will be entering menopause. And so for women living with HIV, we know that menopausal symptoms are common. And we also know that menopausal symptoms can impact a variety of aspects of life. And so HIV negative women have commented that menopausal symptoms impact their work, leisure, sleep, mood, sex life, and quality of life. And so really recognizing the importance of menopausal symptom experience really inspired me to tackle aims related to better understanding menopausal symptoms throughout my CTN fellowship. And so this is basically a guideline of what I've been doing for the last 2 years through my CTN fellowship and outlines my project aims that I proposed 2 years ago in my application. But basically my first aim was to better understand and characterize factors associated with menopause symptom experience. My second aim was to understand treatment patterns for menopausal symptoms in the Canadian context. And then my third aim was to look at whether there may be some hormonal dysregulation or related to menopause symptom experience. And so I'm happy to report that I have completed aim 1 and 2. Some of the data I have already shared with you, and I won't repeat too much today. And we're in the midst of collecting data with the BCC3 study for aim 3. So do stay tuned for that. And so aim 1, I did present the majority of that data during our meetings last year, so I won't repeat that too much. I'll just give you a bit of a Coles Notes version on some of the take-home points. But today I wanted to focus on aim 2, which is basically looking at treatment patterns for symptoms. And so here's just a brief summary of our findings in aim 1. So our findings were once again to look at menopause symptom experience and to look at factors associated with symptoms. And so we looked at almost 500 women living with HIV in the CIHR cohort. And we looked at a composite of menopausal symptoms, and we found that almost 90% of women experienced at least one menopausal symptom in this cohort. And of this, a very prominent symptom were hot flashes. And we found that up to 50% of perimenopausal women living with HIV reported having moderate to severe hot flashes. And we also looked at this with time, and we found that the severity of these hot flashes did not significantly decrease until greater than 5 years in menopause. And so we thought that these findings were quite telling and really lead into the question of how to treat these symptoms. And so that leads me to aim 2, which is really the question of treatment of menopausal symptoms. And so for treatment of menopausal symptoms in general, hot flashes and early menopause are considered first-line indications for hormonal therapy or menopause hormone therapy. And both of these entities are common amongst women living with HIV. Hot flashes, I've just shown you the data there. In early menopause, the estimated prevalence of this for women living with HIV is around 15 to 25%. However, despite this, very little is known about MHT use amongst women living with HIV. And only a few small studies have looked at this, and these studies have collectively suggested low rates of use for women living with HIV. But no studies have looked at the factors relating to these low rates of use. And there's been a number of potential factors that might be driving the low rates of use, including those listed in this list here. Things ranging from drug-drug interactions between antiretrovirals and MHT that might be discouraging use, perhaps increased contraindications to therapy for women living with HIV. Perhaps it relates to provider confidence with MHT prescription or patient preferences. But bottom line is none of these factors have been formally evaluated. And so that really leads us to our study. With our goals of first and foremost evaluating MHT uptake in a large cohort of women living with HIV. And then our second goal was to assess possible barriers to its use. And so in order to do this study, I was fortunate enough to use the CIHR cohort, and we looked at 472 women living with HIV who self-identified as perimenopausal or menopausal. We used survey collected data to ask them whether they had ever used menopause hormonal therapy and whether they were currently using it. And we also looked at correlates to use. And then we did a statistical analysis using logistic regression to examine factors associated with MHT use. And so the general demographics of our cohort are listed here. The median age was 54 years, and around 50% were of white ethnicity, 25% African, Caribbean, and Black, and 18% Indigenous. And the majority had very well-controlled HIV care, with the majority having a suppressed viral load at 88%. Now, one of our main findings was that when we looked at women who had an indication for MHT in this cohort, we found that almost half had an indication, and the indications that we looked at were those defined by the North American Menopause Society, which are early menopause and moderate to severe hot flashes. Despite that, we found that only about 1 in 5 of the women who had an indication for MHT had ever used MHT. So only 10% had ever used MHT. Now, comparing this to population-based estimates, this is around 2 to 3 times lower than what's reported in North American HIV negative women in the literature, where prevalence of MHT is reported to be around 21 to 28%. Another important finding of our study was that we looked at whether women had been asked or had discussed menopause with a care provider. And we found that less than half of the women in our cohort had discussed menopause with their provider. And this was surprising to us because this was a cohort of only perimenopausal and menopausal women. We next went on to look at factors that are associated with MHT use. And so we first did a univariable logistic regression to look at a number of different factors to shed light on possible barriers to use. And here you can see the factors listed. And there were 2 factors that emerged as being significantly associated with MHT use. Women of African, Caribbean, and Black descent had a lower odds of MHT use than those of white ethnicity. And women who had discussed menopause with a care provider had a far higher odds of MHT use than those who had not. And when we put this into a multivariable logistic regression, we found that the only single factor that remained significantly associated with MHT use was whether the woman had discussed menopause with her provider. And so for women who had discussed menopause, they had three times the odds of taking MHT than those who had not discussed menopause. And so key findings from this aim is that MHT is often indicated and seldom used for women living with HIV. And in looking at possible barriers to use, the main barrier that emerged was a lack of menopause discussions with providers as a main barrier to use. And that superseded some of the other things we were expecting, like drug-drug interactions or substance use and income potentially being barriers. This overall underscores the importance of enhanced menopausal awareness and training urgently needed for HIV providers and women living with HIV. I do want to recognize some limitations of this study. So first and foremost, it's cross-sectional design, and then also the lack of control group in the study design. It's also important to note that we assessed women who took MHT, not those who were offered it. And patient preferences for therapy has yet to be evaluated, and I think is a really important area of future study. And then I just wanted to share some of the steps that our group has also taken to bridge this knowledge gap that we identified of the need for further menopausal awareness amongst HIV providers. And one step that we were able to do was to write an opinion piece for the medical community. And we're fortunate to be able to publish this in the Lancet HIV, just to remind people of the importance of considering menopause hormone therapy and to discuss possible benefits of this therapy in the population of women living with HIV. The other thing I wanted to briefly share with this group is this collaborative effort that was led by Sharon, actually, but I just wanted to bring up this, it's basically a practical guide that amongst other things gives a practical step-by-step approach to how to prescribe menopause hormone therapy for women living with HIV. And I just wanted to bring it up as a very useful resource in this context. So final thoughts is that through this research, I really recognize that we as providers need to screen for menopause, ask about symptoms, appreciate that symptoms can impact quality of life and may not subside until well into menopause, and consider treatments and establish referral pathways for symptom management. And so with that, I'd like to close. Thank you so much for your attention today. And I'd like to thank a number of collaborators and individuals who have supported my research along the way. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
So again, another fabulous presentation. Thank you. And thank you for the shout out. And although I was the senior author on that paper, Elizabeth and Anna did the bulk of the work, and it is a really beautiful resource. And we certainly would hope that all of you will look that up and use it in your practice. Elizabeth, I have a question. Is in the women that were prescribed hormonal therapy, did you look at provider as a variable? So if the provider was a woman, or if the provider was a primary care physician as opposed to an HIV specialist, was that a factor that influenced? And my second question is, did you explore who brought up the discussion? Was it the patient or the physician?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. So the first question about the provider, we did look at certain parts of the provider. So we looked at the type of provider we looked at, and we separated it into an infectious disease specialist versus a GP, nurse practitioner, or other specialists. And we didn't find that there was any significant relationship there with MHT use. We did not look at the gender of the provider. We didn't have that information. That would be interesting to look at. And then to your second question, which I'm actually forgetting. Can you remind me? Sorry.
Yeah, so it was in those that did have the discussion, who brought the discussion up?
We don't know. And I think that as well is a very important point. So I don't know if these are provider initiated discussions or patient initiated discussions. I imagine that it's probably a combination of both, but I think bottom line is that it's only happening in 50% of the time. And so I think that certainly there's room for improvement. And I think that this could be a question that providers include as a general screening review of systems in their appointments, and we could increase this easily to 90 or 100%. But it's a good point that I think women also need to feel comfortable and empowered to bring this up to their provider, and they may not feel comfortable at this time.
And I think that leads into Madeline's question, which you've kind of answered, is whether you've explored the reason why so few women living with HIV discuss menopausal symptoms with their care provider.
Yeah, it's a great question, Madeline, as well. I think we haven't explored it. I have some thoughts about it. I think there may be some cultural differences, and women may not feel as comfortable discussing menopause from different cultures, especially if they have a provider that doesn't share their cultural background. I think also there has been a bit of, I'm going to say stigma for lack of another word, but a bit of reluctance in society to discuss menopause as a whole. And so I think that there's overall a movement towards women being more comfortable and open discussing this, but that may also play into things.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with you. I would have thought the drug interaction issue would have been one of the barriers, but you may not have captured it. Because the providers may have had that in their head. I can't do this because of the drug interaction, and therefore didn't bring it up because they didn't know what to do with it if the patient then said that they would want it.
Yeah, potentially. I was surprised. I thought that for sure there would be fewer people. For instance, for PIs, there's a known drug interaction. So I thought I would definitely not see very many PIs and MHT prescribed together. And I didn't see that. And really, I think that these can be safely prescribed. It's just a matter of changing the dosage and not necessarily starting at lower doses and et cetera. But yeah, it may. You're right in that people may not have had the discussion if they knew there was a drug interaction.
It really is actually quite striking if you think about it, because I think in amongst our practice we see the other issue, the andropause issue, coming up quite frequently, where there's lots of discussions about measuring testosterone levels and whether testosterone replacement is appropriate in men living with HIV, and the same attention isn't like being thought about to the same degree, especially given some of the results that you're talking about, the impact of HIV itself on the timing of a menopause, and that there may be premature menopause occurring more frequently in women living with HIV. It really does fall into being one of the associations of HIV infection that needs to be explored and managed correctly for quality of life, for sure. So there's that kind of disconnect, I think, that this work really brings out.
Yeah, and I didn't really talk. I didn't have time to talk about it, but there are a number of other potential benefits of hormonal therapy, and bone health is one major one that I didn't bring up because it's not really an indication, but it is a benefit. That said, I really do think that this needs to be studied specific to our population, or to women living with HIV. It's something that we know that they have index of multimorbidity that's different than HIV negative women, and so I think because of that, it warrants its own investigation.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, Elizabeth, if you heard Peter Hunt's chat at the HIV and Women's Conference this year. He is doing some interesting stuff around the perimenopausal period and the role of inflammation and things like that, and actually had some data that hormone replacement therapy may modulate that inflammation, and there may be some actual benefit, and it's begging for a clinical trial to be done. And if you didn't hear that, go back and have a listen to that chat.
Thanks for pointing it out. I haven't listened to that, and I'll definitely have to check it out. Sounds interesting.
So Madeline has a follow-up question. Here's a tough one. What do we know about the impact of HIV biologic on the timing and extent of menopausal symptoms?
So what do we know about HIV's impact on the extent and timing?
Yeah, of menopausal symptoms.
Not much to my knowledge. So I don't know of any studies. With TWOS, we tried to do as much of a longitudinal assessment as we could, but we're limited in our 18-month time periods and only having 2 waves of data. And while I was doing that, there were no studies to my knowledge that looked at the longitudinal progression of symptoms. It's certainly interesting to find out whether symptoms may last longer or whether there's differences there. But to my knowledge, I'm not sure that we have data on that. Sharon, correct me if you're wrong.
I think the only study is the one in the UK. I'm just blanking on the investigator's name. So they've done some prospective things and have control groups and suggest that menopausal symptoms start earlier, last longer, but are linked to depression and anxiety. So sometimes it's difficult to sort out the HIV component of it. I can't remember the name of their cohort.
I think it might be Shima Tariq is the group, because she's the leading leading expert in UK. So I wasn't familiar with that one, but I know she's done excellent work there. So that's interesting.
You know, and I think, Madeline, this is an opportunity for both you and I think we have them embedded in our aging cohort, but I think embedding some of these menopausal questions in your aging cohort as well, as we having increasing numbers of women getting into those categories.
Wow. I hate to say it, we're going to have to wrap things up because we've reached the end of our session, but I have been so impressed by the quality, scope, and interest of the presentations that were given today. I think clearly our postdoc fellows are meeting the conference theme this year, which is striving towards equity and flourishing in the HIV response. And so we can see a really bright future for HIV research in our country with this work going forward. I've been really pleased to see the number of participants that have stayed here till the end. We have 52 people that are online, and that's probably a record for this session. So it's great that you got this audience, because I think this work is so important. And so I just want to conclude today by thanking my co-chair Sharon and all the great presentations by our postdoctoral fellows, and really look forward to seeing your work progress.
And I would just like to acknowledge Marianne Harris as the leader of the adjudication committee for our fellows. And I think the committee has done a bang up job this year and have picked some absolutely stellar candidates. And we look forward to them continuing in the CTN fold in the future.
Okay, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.